All right, so welcome to Civil 3D 101. And I've got a little Word document. We're not going to have any PowerPoint going on, but this is going to be our basic outline for today's class. We're going to be talking about the user interface and how to customize it to your needs, about saving your workspace so that you can have a familiar working environment, about setting up support files, model space versus paper space, our templates. We have two main templates that we use in Schnabel Endless Shell, basically one for Civil 3D stuff and one for everything else. We'll be talking about CAD natives and modify commands, layers, scale issues, XREFs, data management, and then if we have time, we'll get into printing and the use of CTBs and color within printing and publishing. All of this is we're going to be moving pretty rapidly because there's so much to cover. But those that really wanted to get a huge benefit on Civil 3D learning will be covering a lot more of those topics in terms of surfaces, alignments, profiles, profile views, section views, points, and other Civil 3D objects in tomorrow and Wednesday's class. The idea is to build from the bottom up, from the ground up, with this series of CAD classes. And I really appreciate all of y'all coming and being here today, especially everybody here in this room that has to watch me over here in the corner sort of plugging away here. So again, AutoCAD is the basis for Civil 3D, and what that means is that we can share work between even LT users and vanilla AutoCAD users and people that use AutoCAD architecture and other peripheral products. The .dwg format is fairly universal and is accepted in many other applications. We do a lot of sharing with GIS applications and other 3D modeling and analysis programs. So most of what we'll be covering today is going to be taking place in this bottom square, just regular old vanilla AutoCAD. And we will touch on some civil stuff, and even going forward, we will touch on Map 3D, which is sort of built on top of both Civil 3D and AutoCAD, and is available for all users of AutoCAD Civil 3D 2016. So when you first open up the program, it can be a little bit daunting. Any new program can, and the fact that Autodesk changes this environment every few years doesn't help. Even veteran users can get a little bit startled by a brand new version and how it looks and how it works. But I do want to cover some of the basics of the user interface and give you some terminology to be able to go in and do further research on how to make this thing work as best to your ability. So right now we're going to start with the very top of the screen. This area at the entire top of the screen, I know part of it's being obscured by my presentation thing here, but at the very top of the screen we have what's known as the ribbon. And so the ribbon has multiple tabs: Home, Insert, Annotate, Modify, Analyze, View, Manage, Output, Survey, A360, Help, Add-ins, Raster, and Express Tools, Featured Apps, and we can barely see the others, but there's a few others at the end here, including Geolocation, Whole Base. And you also get a few toolbars that start you off when you first open CAD. I'll go ahead and warn you that these two toolbars that start off when you open Civil 3D. We don't use these two toolbars very much, but I would strongly recommend that you leave them there until you get your user interface set up the way you want. All right. Throughout this class, I'll be talking about some things that are known as system variables. Now, system variables are mostly like on-off switches for your program. So when you type in a system variable, they'll typically be followed by a 0 or a 1. And so I'm going to show you all your first system variable, and that's called menu bar. Menu bar is a great one. It starts off at 0. That means it's off. When you hit 1 and hit enter, you'll notice that we got our file, edit, view, insert, all of these drop downs up here. And these things are incredibly useful, and I use them every single day, and I probably couldn't live with Civil 3D without these drop downs. So that's a highly recommended change to your user interface, is go ahead and write down menu bar equals 1, and just make a note of that because it's going to be very important. And then the reason that I say to leave these two Civil 3D toolbars up, at least in the beginning when you first start Civil 3D, is that with them up is pretty much going to be the only way you're going to have access to this right-click context menu. So what I'm doing here is right-clicking on the space underneath the two toolbars and bringing up these menus of additional tools to bring up. So I'm going to start by going up to the AutoCAD drop-down and picking a few toolbars out of this that I use commonly. Draw and Modify are probably the two most used command toolbars that I use all the time. Now, a lot of these I'll use keyboard shortcuts. We'll get into that shortly about how to access these commands with keyboard shortcuts. But you can see these two automatically docked over on the left-hand side because that's the last place I had them docked in my own personal workspace. And then we'll also bring up a couple other nifty toolbars, including Properties, which is going to show up here on the top. And then once that's there, I can also right-click there to be able to get to additional toolbars. So after Properties, I'll bring in Layers and Layers 2. All right, and just doing a little bit of rearranging here. I usually keep Layers 2 off just to the right of Layers. So just one or two more, and then I'll leave this be. Draw Order is another popular toolbar to keep up for myself with this. Once this is done, once you've gotten some toolbars docked to where you like them, you're free to get rid of these two Civil 3D toolbars because, again, we really just don't use them. This toolbar is for transparent commands, and it's just not often that we find ourselves needing these tools very much at all. So once you get your user interface somewhat like you like it, I'd highly recommend going up here to your workspaces and saving it. And I'm going to save this one as Yates Training. And if I were to make any further changes to this toolbar, to this workspace, for instance, let's say I wanted to bring up my tool palettes and my XREF manager, and then let's see, add another toolbar or two. We'll go ahead and add the Express Standard toolbar and maybe the Views toolbar. Any changes that you make to, there we go. So any changes that you make to the toolbar locations or toolbar, the number of toolbars that you have, up on your screen, you can very easily go back and save over your current workspace. So you would just go back up here to Save Current As, and then go to the drop-down and save over this current one. It'll give you a warning, say Replace, and then you can always get back to that workspace. The reason I say that, there are certain tools, especially some Map 3D things, where you're going to want to go to Planning Analysis because it'll be easier to access the tools that you need for those tasks by switching your workspace to that and then going back to your saved. Just to give you a reference, this is generally what my workspace looks like. There's quite a bit more toolbars up here at the top, mostly dealing with raster design. So those are all saved in your workspace and very, very helpful. The next thing I want to talk about are these buttons along the bottom and all of these options that you have along the bottom. This stuff is easy to ignore if you don't know what's going on down here, but there's some really, really helpful settings and changes that are going on down here at the bottom. And if you find you're a user of Civil 3D in the past, for past versions, and you can't find what you're used to looking at down here, you'll actually find all of that hidden under this customization, this 3-bar customization menu. So you can add things that are not currently listed here. Now, one of the problems here is that all of these are just icons, and it's very difficult to know if you haven't worked in this environment what these icons stand for. So we're going to go over those sort of briefly as we're moving forward. One thing to talk about here is the annotation scale. All right, this is just to point out we are in model space, and we'll have a little bit broader discussion, as it says in our layout, about model space versus paper space in a minute. But right now we're still talking about user interface. So just be mindful that annotation scale, this is somewhat similar to what your print scale is going to look like in a viewport in model space, but it governs or it controls the size of text and annotative objects within your model space. I'll explain that much further going on, but I just want to go ahead and touch on what each one of these mean. Here we have 3 icons that have to do with annotative objects. In brief, annotative objects are objects that will scale themselves automatically based on the set annotative scale that you have over here. Right now, your default for our template is to start off at 1:1. Almost nothing that we do except for some structural drawings or detailing is going to actually be at 1:1. So it's often recommended that you go ahead and change this to a workable scale within your civil environment. Right now, most of these scales are set up for just civil scales. 1 inch equals 20, 30, 40, 1 inch equals 50, and so on. We also have templates that include architectural scales, such as a 1/4 inch equals a foot, an 1/8 inch equals a foot, and so forth and so on. So with these 3 buttons down here, what I'd like to recommend is that you almost always keep this first one selected, Show Annotation Objects. Now, this second button, which if you preview says Add Scales to Annotative Objects when the annotation scale changes. Right now it's turned off, and I highly recommend all users to always keep this button off. And I'll give you a brief example of why. So right now that button is off, and I'm going to add some text objects that are automatically annotative. So I'm going to use the mtext command through a keyboard shortcut, and you can see just by typing in MT, a context comes up that says mtext. I'll go and drop this mtext object here and write out text. Sure. Really big text, and we are at 1 inch equals 20. And I'm also going to open up something so we can refine this object. I'm going to open up something known as the Properties palette. This property palette I have docked here, but if it was missing, you would find it on the Home tab of the ribbon under Palettes. And it's this one right in the corner called Properties. Also, most objects will allow you to go to the Properties menu by selecting an object, right-clicking, and then asking to look at its properties. They'll also open up the Properties palette even if it's docked for you. This little arrow will keep the palette docked for you, and then hitting it again will allow it to auto-hide. Often, for new users, you will see your palettes are docked as these big, broad windows over here. This could be troublesome for some people because if you hover near it, it'll automatically pop out. I recommend keeping it on icon only. It makes it a much smaller area that you really sort of have to find to get it to come out. So as you see, when we select the mtext object, the very top of the Properties menu is telling us what that object is. If you have multiple objects selected, it'll tell you how many and what types of objects those are. So with this piece of text object selected, we can tell that it's an mtext object, that it's set to by layer. We'll get into that in more information. And its layer was the current layer that I started on, which is layer 0, shown here and here. There's other information about line type, line scale, plot style, line weight. There's a lot of information. The Properties palette is extremely powerful in terms of changing this data. Here I'll note that this piece of mtext is style-based. It's on a standard style for us, which is called SE Anno, which stands for Annotative Standard. This pushes out an Arial font text, which is a true type font, and right now it's got the annotative scale set to 1 equals 20. If we were to click on this little box to the side of the annotative scale, we'll hang up CAD and probably crash it. Let's try that again. No? It doesn't like us. That's okay. All right, and then we look at some things like justification. There's a lot of data in this property palette, and with almost everything we do, even with all of our civil objects and everything, this property palette can be very beneficial to leave open almost all the time. So now what I'm going to do is turn on this godforsaken button called Add Scales to Annotative Objects when the annotation scale changes. And what happens, you'll notice, I'm just going to cycle through. I'm going to go to 1 to 10. Look, everything shrank. And it's like, you know, I don't really like the look of that. Let's go to 1 to 40. I don't know. Let's see what 1 to 100 looks like. Okay, that's nice and big. So what happened with having this button selected is that now we've added versions. Look at this. We've added versions of each one of those scales of that object. That's the power of this button, and that's actually very detrimental for working in CAD, because now technically we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 or 5 different copies of each piece of these text. You can see small, medium, large here on each one of these. Now where they're all hidden but they're still there. If we were to go back to any one of those scales, we'll see that they're all there, and they're all going to, in a complicated drawing with surfaces and alignments and profiles, this could add an extra layer of complication to the drawing, which can make it more crash prone and make it take longer to open. So for these reasons, I'd like to highly recommend that everyone avoid this button entirely. Okay, we'll go through some of these others in just a second, but I just want to show you all how to clean up some of these annotative scales should you find that you have too many. So what I'm doing here is I've selected a piece of text, and then I'm going to right-click on the screen to go to this object, or this option within the right-click context menu called Annotative Object Scale List, and I'm going to go to Add Delete Scales. We should be getting a pop-up here. It is taking its own sweet time. Yeah, this we may be having some interference with the recording software that's not allowing us to access that window. What the window should allow us to see is a list of object scales that we can then delete the scales that we no longer want. So moving on from there, since that's not working, and I apologize. Moving on from there, let's talk about Object Snap. Object Snap is very useful for refining what types of geometry you would like the geometry you're currently working on to snap to. You can bring up the entire list through the Object Snap settings here. All right, that pop-up didn't have problems. And as you can see, Object Snap On has a toggle button within your function keys of F3. So tapping F3 on your keyboard will turn that off and on. And then Object Snap Tracking can be turned on and off with F11 function key. So these object snaps can be modified through this menu or through the drop down here if we wanted to add objects to the Object Snap menu. And the way this works, guys, is if I'm going to start a polyline. A polyline is our standard simple piece of line work. Yeah, I tried. Thanks a lot, Jacob. I actually tried that first, and it also was refusing to open it up. If y'all didn't see Jacob's text, he suggested opening it through the Properties menu. And that is this button here, and it seems to have having a problem bringing up that pop-up menu. Unless it's bringing it up in the background, we're just not seeing it. I don't think we're seeing it. But I appreciate the recommendation, Jacob. So, again, with object snaps, I've got a polyline here. We can see the Properties menu is telling us it's a polyline and the layers and information on it. There's also some helpful information because it's a closed polyline about the area. This is going to be in your current units of the drawing, which in this case is going to be square feet, and the length of the entire line based on the perimeter length. It's telling us it's closed and the line type generation is enabled. What I'm going to do is start another polyline, and as we can see, because I have the object snap properties for endpoint and midpoint selected, it is snapping and it gives me a green square at the endpoint location. If we were to move over to about the midpoint, you see between the endpoint and the midpoint, it's going to snap to one of those two. So you can see I don't even have to be on that midpoint for it to snap. As long as it's highlighted, that next polyline command is going to start right on that midpoint command. If, for instance, I wanted it to snap at the perpendicular location down here, I could either go down and add perpendicular to this list, and it will snap, and it gives me a right angle icon there, again in the color green. It's telling me that I'm snapping at the perpendicular. If I am, but then, let's see. So those three are still selected, endpoint, midpoint, and perpendicular. And you can see each one is attempting to snap. If, for some reason, I only wanted to have a sort of a temporary snap, I can hold down the Shift key and then right-click, and then I get a specialized context menu that just has to do with snapping. So holding down the Shift key and right-clicking will bring up a temporary snap condition. This will not change the settings of your OSNAP menu, but will allow you to snap to something temporarily. For instance, nearest. Nearest means that it's just going to snap wherever on this line that I'm getting near to. So because I have nearest selected in that shift right click menu, it's overriding any other type of snap condition and is just looking for the nearest condition. Is there any questions on O snaps or annotative scales at this point, everybody? I think we're looking pretty good. Let's keep going. Yes, sir.
What's the command to draw that green dashed line to kind of guide you where like an intersection would be? Yeah.
So we have a question here in the house from Corey. He's asking about, what I think he's asking about is something called X lines, and it draws a line across the entire screen. Is this what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Wait a second. No. Oh, I drew a line command. I drew a line command. All right. X lines are on here somewhere, but we can use the keyboard shortcut. So an X line is basically like a guide that will go across the entire screen. So we could zoom out forever and ever 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 and ever, and that X line is still going to be there, and it's going to go across the entire line. So that command is X line, and you can find it here on the draw toolbar. Or here it's called a construction line, I apologize. But it's essentially the same thing. X-line, construction line are essentially the same thing. I don't use construction lines or X-lines very much. I know that Rob Indry uses them a lot. They can be useful if you're lining up multiple copies of something and you want to make sure, like say you have multiple elevation views of a tunnel in your case, Laura, or section views of a tunnel and you want the bottom of each section view to line up across the page, you could use X-lines to do that. Okay? So as we go again through our user interface here, we've talked about our OSNAP commands. Here we have this is the F11 command, which is the auto snap tracking. It's a good one to leave on if you have OSNAP on. I will say this, guys, if you're doing line work, if you're drawing a polyline across a complicated series of other line work, whether it be surfaces or other objects, XREFs, and if you're drawing lines across an area and you do not need to snap, and there's a lot of data in your drawing, I would highly recommend that you turn OSNAP off just by clicking that. You can see that it's off now, and if I were to start a polyline command, it's not going to snap to anything unless I turn it back on or shift right click and go to select a specific OSNAP option. One other thing I'd like to point out in that shift right click context menu is this is a pretty nifty command midway between 2 points. This is allowing me to select a midpoint between two objects that may not have necessarily a line or a midpoint there. So I've selected that, and now I would need to have OSNAP back on for it to work. But I'll select the endpoint here and an endpoint here, and it's going to pick the exact midpoint between those 2 points. Again, I started the polyline command with PL enter, and then before I started my polyline, I hit shift right click, and then selected midway between 2 points. This time I'll choose this one, and it starts that line at the midpoint between those 2 points. All right? Now, the next icon I'd like to point you all to in terms of this bottom area of settings is called polar tracking. This is a very helpful setting which can allow for you to snap to certain angles as you're drafting. So I'll start a polyline here, and as you can see, it's this green dashed line is snapping at 0 degrees. That's because my polar tracking is set to 45 degrees at increments of 45. So anywhere I start, it's going to snap at 0 degrees, 45 degrees, 90 degrees, 135 degrees, 180, and so forth and so on, all the way across the 360-degree spectrum. If we were to change that to the 30-degree polar tracking setting, we'd see that we would get 30, 60, 90. And this can be very helpful if you're drawing certain types of objects. So often I will use both polar snapping and polar snapping and O snaps, object snapping. Most of the time I'm drafting. It's only in really complicated drawings that I'll turn either of those two objects off because I don't want it to snap to certain things within certain geometry within the drawing, or I want to save on resources. So if your CAD is trying to constantly find an O snap to attach to while you're drawing a line across objects, it can slow down performance considerably.
Is there a way to reorient that polar?
Absolutely. So again, under polar snaps, you can change from these presets of 5, 10, 15, 18, 23, 30, 45, and 90, or you can go into tracking settings to set up your own incremental angle should you so wish.
So, like the 0 angle?
That is a different, what you're asking would not be handled through what I think you're asking would not be handled through polar tracking. Okay. In other words, if you want north to be at a different angle, is that what you're sort of saying?
Like if I wanted a 45-degree line, but my drawing isn't.
Right. That's something we'll have to cover later as we go through this sort of the simple things here with the user interface. I think I have an idea of what you're asking, and there are ways to tackle it, but not necessarily through object snapping or through polar snapping. The last, not least, is this one called dynamic input. Dynamic input I've just turned off, but it's pretty helpful in terms of being able to get some information off of your drawing. So with dynamic input turned off, we can see that I've drawn a polyline here, and without looking, I can tell the length of it by looking over here at the properties palette. But what dynamic input will allow me to do is hover over that line and give me a live dimension on that line as I'm working with it. There are other benefits to using dynamic input, including being able to see your commands pop up right next to your cursor. So in other words, when I type in PL with dynamic input, it shows up there with a context of other commands that I might be wanting to use that are cycled, that can be accessed either with your cursor or with the keyboard. So dynamic input is just another fairly useful sort of quality of life improvement in CAD Civil 3D. Okay, let me refresh my memory with what we're supposed to be talking about. I think we're pretty much finished with our user interface. So we talked about user interface. We've talked about saving your workspace. All right. So this is really for brand new people on Civil 3D. The next thing is very, very important. It's about support files, and this is something I really I wouldn't expect many of you all to have to jump into every single day by any means. But when you first open CAD, when you first open Civil 3D after a brand new installation, you will notice that things are not going to work as you or expect them to, probably because you don't have your support files set up properly. So to access your support files, you can right-click anywhere in the drawing and go to the bottom where it says Options. And over here on the far left-hand tab is your support file structure. We have a document that covers setting up your support files on our server, along with a number of other training documents that I'll be happy to make accessible to any of the other offices that are signed on right now. I mean, we can make copies of these training documents on your servers as well. But one of the very first classes I've taught here at the Greensboro office was about setting up this user interface options and workspace. And this is an absolutely essential go-to for any new CAD user within the Schnabel working environment. This includes the shell, obviously. And it goes through how to access this Files tab and which files need to be repathed to our server and the reason for doing so. So just be mindful that these resources exist on our server. And I'll be happy to send them out to anybody that needs them. And we'll be going over one of them, the next one, which is about AutoCAD natives, objects, and commands, right after our break. We've got a break coming up in about 4 or 5 minutes, everybody. It's just going to be a quick bathroom break, and then we'll come back to it. So going back to our support file path. The reason this is so important, the reason support files need to be set up at a centrally located server location is that by default they are pointing to your C drive. And since we work in a multi-user environment, we need everybody to sort of sing from the same sheet of music. And so in our case here in Greensboro, we have everybody going to a partition on our server called the K drive, which is our resources drive. There's a CAD folder within that resources drive, and then a support folder that everything points to. And so when you first open up Civil 3D, this folder at the top will not be there. This one will be your top folder, and you'll actually have to go in and click Add, and then Browse, and then navigate to your local server and to a designated location for your CAD support folders. In this case, we're pointing to the 2014 support folder because it has not quite been updated for 2016, but everything still works perfectly. And you would add that master support folder and then move it up to the very top of this list. We're going to have 2 copies of it now, so I'll go ahead and delete one of them. After you've set the master support file search path folder, the other 2 areas that you're going to want to pay attention to are printer support file path and template settings. Under printer support file path, it is the printer configuration search path, the printer description file search path, and the plot style table search path that are going to be edited to point to the server. The printer spooler can still stay in your C drive, and that is no big deal. But everything else needs to be pulling the information that it needs for the plotters and the plot styles from the server-based location. This ensures that everyone's using the same CTB files for their CAD plot settings, and that everybody's using the same printer description files for their printing, whether it's printing to PDF or DWF, publishing to PDF or DWF, or printing 8.5 by 11 or 11 by 17s to your copier, or big 22 by 34 larger sheets to your plotter. The other one, templates, is the most important thing to change, and all 4 of these would need to be updated to the server location, again using the document that we have here, the first document in our training lunch and learn folder, user interface options workspace. We'll walk you through where to path all of these in reference to the Greensboro server, and I'll be happy to set up any other offices up with support files at a central location. IT will be glad to help, I'm sure, in getting that all set up. Most of you already have this set up at your location, but if you need any help with this, please don't hesitate to reach out. So once all of this is set, you'll hit apply and then OK. And then when you go to open a new drawing, so what I'm doing here is clicking up on the icon for Q New. Q New, in our case, opens up the Civil 3D template. All right, we're 1 minute from my countdown on my timer here from taking our first break, which is fortuitous because I have to go to the bathroom. But we'll pick back up in just 3 to 5 minutes, guys, on templates and model space versus paper space, and sort of roll into XREFs, natives and modified commands, layers, and a bunch of other issues going forward. So everybody get a time to stretch your legs, and we'll come right back to this in just a minute. All right, everybody? Thanks so much.